Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next in the series of webinar Wednesdays. My name is John Flaherty, and I'm Deputy Director at GrowSmart, Rhode Island, and I'm happy to be at the controls this morning. Usually CJ is at the controls, and just give me 1 second to get our screen share up here. So today's webinar is Faster Transit, Less Congestion, Best Practices in Implementing Bus Priority Lanes. And we're very pleased to have an experienced team with us this morning to talk about where it has succeeded and where it's being implemented now in Rhode Island. We have Greg Nordine, who's Chief of Strategic Advancement at RIPTA, and Matt Moran, who's Director of the Transit Team for the City of Boston and the Boston Transportation Department. And we have Sandra Clary, who's Project Manager and Senior Transit Planner at McMahon Associates. So welcome all. Do have a few housekeeping items. First of all, we wish that we were doing this in person at our March 27th Power of Play Summit, but COVID got in the way of that. And so we've extended the summit in a virtual way that started June 3rd and extends through September 23rd with Wednesday webinars. And then on September 25th, we're going to have a half-day plenary featuring some keynote speakers, one of whom is Scott Spencer of Smart Growth America, also of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And then we have award-winning columnist E.J. Dion of the Washington Post. So I invite you to visit our website, see the other offerings we have through September 23rd. And next, I would like to thank and acknowledge our many sponsors. And I'd encourage you to take a good long look at this. Without our sponsors, this Power of Play Summit would just not be possible. So we thank them, and we encourage you to thank them as well if you're talking to any of them. We also have full speaker bios on our website, so we didn't go into that this morning. We're reserving as much time as possible for our discussion. For planners in the audience, this webinar has been approved for 1 AICP credit, and you can find on our website how to log on to claim your credit for that. Finally, we will have a Q&A session toward the end of we're going to reserve enough time for discussion, but there'll be a Q&A feature. We invite you to submit your questions, and I'll help Greg to field those questions. And then finally, this session is being recorded, and we'll provide a copy of the recording to all of you who are registered. And at the conclusion of the summit, the end of September, we'll publish them publicly. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg Nordine, who's going to moderate the session. And I will stop sharing my screen and invite Greg to share his. And just take a moment. One benefit is we're going to have a single PowerPoint, so we won't have to switch in between. So if you just bear with us for a moment.
Yeah, thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. Morning, everyone. It's a little unique doing things this way, but I'm glad to be a part of this. And I just want to take a moment and commend John and GrowSmart Rhode Island on adapting to this crisis. And, you know, it's unfortunate that the GrowSmart Summit was unable to proceed as planned, but this seems like a really great and adaptive way to have addressed that. So I thank you for continuing forward and giving us this platform to talk about bus lanes today. I'm actually going to pretty quickly turn this over to Sandra and Matt. We're going to give a brief presentation this morning just to talk a little bit about sort of bus lanes and best practices in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Quite honestly, I'll just be very upfront. I think Rhode Island actually has a lot to learn from some of the great work that's going on up in Massachusetts and Boston area. And so I'm going to hopefully talk a little and listen a lot, and hopefully we'll have a really fruitful discussion today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Sandra and Matt. Sandra, am I giving you control, or Matt?
Me first.
Thank you.
All right, so good morning, everyone. Thanks very much to Greg and John for that introduction. As they both noted, I work for the Boston Transportation Department. I lead a team there called the Transit Team. So I'll get into a little bit of context, but thanks also to Sandra for being an amazing partner for all the work we do, helping us to design and install these bus lanes. My part of the conversation will mostly focus on sort of the community and sort of policy angle. And then Sandra's will mostly focus on a lot of the design and sort of the implementation angle. And we'll sort of talk about two distinct projects, the process that sort of led to each of them, the design that led into each of them, and then turn it over to Greg for some additional feedback for the sort of Rhode Island context. So I'm going to try to advance this slide. I think I have control now. Let's see. In theory, Greg, I'm controlling your screen.
Yes, there you go.
Okay, I think we've got it. So the Boston Restoration Department, where, as I mentioned, I work, we have two core missions. First is to advance public and transportation safety, and the second is to manage the city's street network. So I think the second point is very critical, right? So we coordinate closely with other city and state agencies and, of course, community organizations. So the city of Boston obviously controls the rights of way, the signals, the curb, the lane markings, but we partner with the MBTA, which is the regional transit agency, as I'm sure many of you know, that actually runs the bus services. They run sort of, they control the frequency, they control sort of the quality of the service. But by partnering together, we can implement things that will sort of help to benefit Boston residents and provide higher quality of transit service. A lot of our goals are guided by Go Boston 2030, which is a really, really comprehensive transportation guide for where the city wants to go between now and 2030. So it's the goal of it is really to shift commute habit. So trying to get as many people onto bikes and transit as possible and away from sort of the single occupancy vehicle commuting patterns. So what is our bus challenge? And I think this photo kind of showcases it pretty well, which is, a lot of the context I'm going to give is pre-COVID, but I think it's still going to be relevant to the discussion today. But we're increasingly facing a congestion challenge in the city. And we know that to move the greatest number of people possible, we need to shift people into buses and onto bikes. And so what you're seeing here is a scene that's familiar to folks throughout Greater Boston. This is in South Boston, but typically you'll get buses that sort of stack up at many intersections. And there's certain things that we can do to help advance buses. So, as I mentioned before, the quality of our bus trips is declining. We're also facing equity concerns, and I'll get into that in a second. And we're facing fast population growth, which is another reason why we need to address some of these challenges. So, as mentioned before, increasing travel time due to congestion. As you can see on sort of this shot on the lower right, our schedule reliability is decreasing. The trip times, especially at peak hours, is increasing. And as a result, we've seen a decline in bus ridership along many corridors due to this unreliability, despite seeing growing population. This is sort of a map that helps to show where we have the most delay in passenger hours. And this really helps to inform where we're going to be implementing, or we have implemented bus lanes and where we plan to implement more. So this was done by the Regional Transportation Modeling Group, Central Transportation Planning staff. But you can see many of the key corridors in the city face significant levels of congestion and also have very, very high passenger counts. So Mass Ave is right here, Malcolm X Boulevard, Warren Street are here. And two of the corridors that we're going to be talking about, Brighton Avenue over here, and Rosendale's Washington Street down here. So just for some additional context on especially the equity front, 73% of transit trips in the city of Boston are longer than 30 minutes. And communities of color in particular face significantly higher commute times and less reliable transit options. This view is Blue Hill Avenue on the right, which, as you can see, frequently has a lot of congestion, but also has extremely high bus ridership. Parts of the city have some of the longest commutes in the Boston region, despite being very close to the urban core. So Mattapan, which community largely of color, in many instances economically disadvantaged has a commute time of 45 minutes compared to a typical Bostonian whose commute is about 28 minutes. Today, very low-income families in sections of Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan also bear a transportation cost burden of 33%, which compares to an average of 13% citywide. So a lot of the reasons we're working on these issues relate to equity and sort of these paramount concerns. In addition to that, Boston's seeing fast regional growth. So Greater Boston, in particular, is one of the fastest growing urban regions in the Northeast. We've had about 350,000 people in the region since 2010. Massachusetts population is growing faster than the US average, and that's the first time since the 1950s that's happened. And then just in the city itself, Boston is expected to add 50,000 more jobs by 2030. And between 2010 and 2030, Boston's expected to grow by more than 100,000 people. So that's just within the city limits of Boston. And for some context, and again, this was pre-COVID, but Boston's net population growth was more than 400 people per month. So what does implementation look like in Boston? So here's where I'm going to dive into a lot of the policy and community considerations that went into the implementation in the city. So we're going to talk about two key corridors, as I mentioned before, Washington Street and Rosendale, and sort of what we learned from a pilot that we did there, and then later the permanent implementation, and then on Brighton Avenue, which is in Allston, and when to skip the pilot, and lessons learned from there. And these will both be interspersed with sort of my discussion, and then turning it over to Sandra to talk about the design. So Rosendale, if you noted, sort of is a key community. It's a sort of a large community in the southwest part of Boston. So there's a number of bus routes that lead into Forest Hills, which is the end of the Orange Line. And so this like just under a mile corridor faced serious congestion problems. So it could take up to 30 minutes to go the last mile on a bus between Rosendale Village and Forest Hill Station due to this congestion. Very, very high bus ridership. So 18,000 MBTA bus passengers, plus a number of Boston Public School buses use the corridor. So, as I said, as you can see from the picture on the right, severe congestion, and as a result, unreliable trips. So up until this point, we hadn't done a new bus lane in the city since the early 2000s. So if you're familiar with the Silver Line, that was the last bus lane that the city had done. So we wanted to do a pilot just to show, does this make sense? This is something where giving up some parking during certain hours of the day is something that will be practical and will sort of serve the community well, will actually improve trip times. We did some ground outreach with Livable Streets. So they were a partner in sort of doing survey work, and I'll get into their role in a few more slides. So the first thing we did was we did a 2-day mini pilot in December of 2017. And what we did here was we actually did it on street cleaning days. So a lot of the vehicles that were in the parking lane, which you can see on the right, weren't parked there just anyway because of normal street cleaning. And we sort of used some of the takeaways from that pilot to look at what we could do for a full month pilot in May of 2018. So some of the takeaways were, simple things like, okay, we need to trim some tree limbs because the tree limbs, while they're fine for a parked car, don't work as well for a bus. It was, do we install permanent or temporary signage during the pilot? How do we put cones out? Where do cones go in relation to some of the cross streets in the corridor? Basic things like that. So for the full month pilot in May, we used traffic cones, as you can see on the right. We had VMS boards, and we had sort of temporary no parking signs. And then we worked closely with the Boston Transportation Department's parking enforcement team, Boston Police and MBTA Police on enforcement, and really just getting the word out, right? So we flyered the corridor, and we sort of let people know, hey, this is coming up, stuck flyers in windshields, stuck flyers in mailboxes, and worked with the merchants, again, just so there weren't any surprises. As you know, actually, on the first day, we didn't have to tow a single car from the corridor, sort of a little bit of pride because of sort of this early outreach that was done to the community. So there were some surveys that were handed out. We talked to bus riders, we talked to bike riders, and people loved this sort of this new sort of peak period bus lane. And I should say bus lane, but it was also a bike lane because cyclists are also allowed to use the lane. And so over 90% of bus riders were satisfied with the lane. 96% of cyclists were actually satisfied with the lane because if you can imagine, previously they just had sort of small 5-foot wide bike lane between the parking and general traffic. But now they had a much wider lane. And a typical biker actually will pass a bus on the corridor because when a bus is stopped at a bus stop picking up passengers, they can kind of go around. So a lot of cyclists liked it. So buses tended to save a lot of time. So typical trips, again, this is not the extreme where, as I said before, it could have been up to 30 minutes, but typical trips saved 20 to 25%. And this was reduced by about 6 minutes from sort of that, typical AM peak commute. But we also saw that there were no variations, right? Or almost no variations in the travel time. So that led to sort of a lot of reliability or perception of improved reliability amongst passengers. This led to the permanent implementation in the summer of 2018. So going on 2 years now. So what did we learn? This pilot was actually very labor intensive due to staff time, putting down cones and some enforcement challenges. It was labor intensive outreach by community groups and advocates, but I think that was all very well worth it to sort of get the word out and allow people to understand exactly what was coming and when. And we also showed that with the pilot, the AM bus lane was beneficial. And so we collected data from last fall. So we compared the fall prior to implementation to the fall after implementation. So we saw that ridership grew by nearly 5% on all the sort of on the corridor where the bus lane was implemented. So that's about 160 additional riders per day. And we also had sort of so much success from this that now we're working with the community to install a PM peak bus lane going in the outbound or southbound direction. Again, because people seem to like that sort of AM bus lane so much. And also we heard from a lot of folks that the sort of PM peak was still unreliable and they would love to take the morning, the bus in the morning, but they couldn't or they didn't want to because so we're hoping for additional ridership gains with that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sandra. This is where I'm going to stop my remote control, and Greg, you have to turn it over to Sandra.
Sandra, you should be all set.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so we were under the gun from the beginning of this project. The operational cost, as Matt said, was a lot, very expensive for the city. So there was a lot of interest to get the bus line in permanently as quickly as possible. Luckily for us, we already had a contract mechanism with the MBTA in place that had a generic enough scope for bus corridor improvements that we were able to hit the ground running. So we went from scoping to construction in only 3.5 months. And it should be noted that the MBTA has facilitated and funded the design of the majority of the bus lane work to date. In the city of Boston, the city's on-call contractor has actually constructed the projects, but they were reimbursed by the MBTA, who had the funding available, but weren't necessarily had the capabilities to fast track implementation. So, and that reimbursement is through a memorandum of understanding between the city and the T, and includes a clause as well for ongoing maintenance of the bus lane once it's in place. So for Wilson Day, we really dived straight into developing the design standards. Like Matt said, it's been over a decade since the last bus lane, but we had a lot of national guidance to go off of. And so rather than focusing on the plans initially, we kind of focused on some of the elements. So making some of those key decisions. Do we paint the bike lane red? Do we paint all the parking spaces or none? The red paint's really expensive. So some of that would kind of weighed into that decision making. And also we had to develop signage, some of it a little bit customized. So that really became a collaborative working relationship between the consultant team, the city and the MBTA to make strategic decisions and quickly as the plans were being developed while we kind of started working on the base plans. We didn't do survey for any of these corridors, at least for the signing and striping. Luckily, the city has a decent, robust GIS mapping available. So we're just able to supplement that with some field work. And they've also been aggressively rolling out a number of bike lane projects throughout the city. So in some cases, we're able to kind of piggyback off of those and just verify the current conditions. So we didn't do any traffic work as part of this. The pilot worked, so it was full steam ahead in the design. And so within a month, we had a concept design that really outlined the existing conditions and the pavement markings, which were then tweaked. And then we just did plans and quantities. No cost estimate. City already had specs readily available. So we were able to finalize those construction documents very quickly and get into construction in October. There we go. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the design elements. These are some extracts from the construction documents that we did. And in developing the signage, we did draw on examples from around the country, but ultimately they needed to follow the MUTCD, which is kind of the national engineering standards for what they call preferential and managed lanes, i.e. bus lanes, among other things. So they aren't unique to the Boston area. They can be applied anywhere really. And some of the striping details, I'll just say, did evolve over time. So for instance, like the width of the lane line on the left-hand side, how we dealt with the skip stripe. But the bus lane, the right lane designation was highlighted here for bus lanes and bikes. Just to note the hours of operation and that bikes were allowed, and also signed that there was the beginning of the bus lane. And we started with this skip stripe in the middle of the intersection to kind of show that side street traffic would be interacting with the bus lane. And at the beginning of the bus lane, it just happened to also be a bus stop. Oh, this is a little bit delayed. So we striped through the bus stop and then continue kind of on some of the blocks. So as we continue down the corridor, on both sides of the intersection, we did about a 20-foot section of red striping on each side. Both the bike lane and the parking lane was striped in each case. And on the far side of the intersection, or the receiving side, we implemented the bus lane and the hours of operation. So we did kind of tweak. Lane was used on the Washington Street bus lane that Matt mentioned, but we've now kind of transitioned to being bus only, kind of more in line with more of the national standards. And on the side street, the city had heard concerns from the neighborhood about a lack of awareness of the bus lane approaching from the side street. So they did ask us to create some customized signage. And this was the result of that. Although that hasn't been implemented anywhere else since that time. And then there was also other spots where no parking zones, where we put additional red paint, and also if there was a long block, we added additional striping and signage to reinforce the bus lane. And then after implementation, the city felt like they could really do with some type of warning device as well to warn drivers that the bus lane was in effect. So we've come up with a couple of options. This is one of them to highlight that device. So it has like a flashing outer edge, or we might do something with a blinker beacon type of situation. But like Matt said, the inbound has been so successful. They're really focused on implementing an outbound bus lane now, as well as extending the inbound, adjusting some stop locations, reconstructing some stops, and just generally improving pedestrian connectivity at bus stops. So as part of our most recent efforts, we developed a long roll plan for their public process that would show that. So you can see here, this is, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving. This is the extension of the inbound lane, starting a little bit further to the south and west. There's some stop consolidation in here. Eventually, we'd like to really enhance the bus stops here with some curb extensions, and then showing the outbound lane, which we hope to implement from 2 to 7 period. And then in the middle of the corridor, this is a stop optimization plan that the MBTA prepared and shows some of those pedestrian crossing improvements as well. And we will get survey eventually for these locations here to ensure that there's ADA compliant bus stops along the route. And then finally at the most northern segment, an extension of the inbound line all the way into the Forest Hills upper busway, and then showing the start of the outbound lane as well. So it kind of sounds like it has been a multi-phased approach to this, and that may continue. In response to COVID, the city is hoping that we'll actually get to implement the outbound lane this fall. But the pandemic has had an impact on the rollout. They had to switch to virtual public engagement, which they also did with the merchants back in early July. There's been a surge in interest in outdoor dining. So some permits have been issued that are now occupying part of the southern part of the outbound bus lane. So hopefully we get to implement maybe 90% of the lane in the near term. And then next year come back and do some of those physical bus stop improvements. So Matt, back to you for a minute.
Great, thank you, Sandra. So, all right, I believe I have control of the remote screen. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Sandra. So the next project I'm going to talk a little bit about is Brighton Avenue, which, there we go. So for a little bit of context, and I apologize, but it appears that the slide got a little bit changed, but Brighton Avenue goes from Union Square, which is in sort of the border of Allston and Brighton, to Packards Corner. So it's, but it's really the commercial core of the Allston neighborhood of Boston. It's about 2/3 of a mile. And it's lined with mostly businesses, shops, a mix of some residential, some small office buildings, but it's really like a commercial core for the neighborhood. And that really helped to, having that sort of really, really strong merchant outreach throughout this process really helped to inform the design, and I think made it a better project overall. So I can't really stress that enough, and you'll hear a lot about that in this discussion. So why a bus lane on Brighton Avenue? So in this 2/3 of a mile stretch, we were looking at about 7-minute delay in the AM peak. And we have very, very heavy ridership. So just in the eastbound direction of Brighton Avenue, there's about 7,600 MBTA bus riders. There's about 1,200 cyclists per day. And we also know that there's a number of school buses that operate on this corridor, but it's a bit less than in Rosendale. And as I'm going to be talking about in a minute, we also had very, very strong community support for this based on both outreach that the city did to stakeholders and elected officials, and also from survey work that we've done and partnered with some community groups. So when to skip the pilot, or when to think about skipping a pilot and just going straight into implementation. So we had advocacy from sort of several different community groups. We had general community buy-in based on some meetings that we had hosted or attended and presented at. And then we also did strong merchant outreach and literally talked to every business on the corridor and sort of got their opinion about how a bus lane might work, might look, might feel. Obviously not all cared, not all gave us feedback, but some who did give us very, very critical and important feedback. So the winter of 2018, Livable Streets and the Allston Brighton Health Collaborative began outreach efforts. They talked directly with bus riders, cyclists, and merchants. So it was this preliminary outreach to the community, and again, with like really, really good survey work. And that produced some data. So at least on sort of the people who were interviewed on Brighton Avenue, most were walking or taking transit sort of within Allston. The survey revealed that 63% of people spend money in Allston Village, which is this sort of the area that's kind of the node of Harvard Ave and Brighton Avenue. And 40% of people that we spoke to live within about a 10-minute walk of Allston Village. So on the sort of business outreach, we learned that most receive deliveries between 9 and 5. More than half of employees get to work using walking or taking transit. And then the employees that drive tend to have some parking challenges. So when we met to discuss this in sort of the winter of 2019, we concluded that the pilot wasn't warranted due to strong community support. So the design efforts that we started to focused on two distinct concepts. One was, and Sandra will get into the details of these two concepts, but one was a concept that focused on a peak-only bus lane that would use the parking, similar to Brighton Avenue, or an all-day bus lane that would use the right travel lane. Brighton Avenue is a 4-lane cross-section, so 2 lanes in either direction with turn lanes. So a lot of the merchants, especially that we talked to, felt that they could not lose their parking even during the morning peak, because the feeling was even though most deliveries happened after 9, they still got deliveries before 9. Some shops were open before 9, and there was just a general sense that sort of adding an extra lane to the road would make the road feel and sort of look too wide. So that revealed a very strong preference to use the right travel lane instead of sort of the parking lane. And that's how we ended up going with that effort. So this is a nice little shot from the ribbon cutting that we did back in the spring of last year. So we sort of got a nice group together and sort of, celebrated the ribbon cutting. We also had sort of ceremonial first bike ride and first bus ride, which was a lot of fun. But, I think what some key takeaways from this were, pilots can be a great resource, but they can also be labor intensive. So be strategic when you do them. There's good reasons to do pilots to demonstrate what's possible and to get buy-in. That's a new idea. But at the end of the day, those should really be dictated by community outreach and what your community is telling you, what local advocates are telling you. So, having data to sort of back up decisions to especially leadership and to stakeholders, elected officials, to justify a project will be as well. So getting data from existing available resources or through community surveys. And then sort of once you make your decision, develop next steps for further improvements. The nice takeaway from Brighton Avenue is following the successful implementation in the spring of 2019, we actually went forward and in the fall of 2019 implemented the westbound bus lane because folks seem to be so happy about sort of the results of the eastbound lane. So we're still crunching data. So in a very preliminary way, we've seen that bus ridership, and again, this was pre-COVID, went up 10 to 15% after we implemented the bus lane. So fall of 2019 compared to fall of 2018 data. Again, still preliminary, but you can see that there's sort of a positive trend in the direction of better bus ridership. So that's, I'm going to turn it back over to Sandra.
So that meant for us that we were on yet another aggressive design schedule. But like Matt said, we were focused on 2 alternatives, both incorporating the bike and the parking lane, and then looking at the travel lane option. So this time we did have to do some traffic analysis, but we didn't do a full-on traffic impact study, nor did the city impose that on us. We produced a technical memo, provided summary results and the synchro model, but using available data supplemented with some field observations. So, but despite the level of service drop in that, there was community support, city support. So it was full steam ahead on let's take the travel lane 24/7. So we refined that concept very quickly, and even though the public engagement process was still ongoing while we're fleshing out some of this design, this meant that the MBTA was still willing to fund the design, but they were confident that it was going to get implemented. So they're willing to take that risk, and they didn't want to deviate from the momentum that was already underway. So meanwhile, there was a bit of a change around this time for us on the contractual side of things. The T introduced for the first of its kind a bus system enhancements on-call general engineering contract worth about $3 million, which has already been increased to about $7 million, and there's 2 contracts out there. So there's really a lot of support on the T's end to help support the design efforts for implementing these lanes. So we were able to move quickly into final design, PS&E, and construction by June. But that was just the phase one piece of it. Like Matt said, we did look to do an outbound lane as well. We actually skipped doing any concept and preliminary design this time around. There was so much confidence in the, the design or the type of bus lane that was going to get implemented that we went straight into 90% design by September, final design in October, and then we just about made it into construction before the winter moratorium hit in November. So what did this bus lane look like? Well, it's a little bit different to Rosendale in that we're using the travel lane. We did introduce using the bus lane ahead sign, and we we looked at ways to, where to start the bus lane. This section abuts a very complex and heavily traveled intersection, so we felt it best to actually allow traffic to come in on the receiving side and then merge at this bus stop that exists here. We did add some overhead signage for added emphasis. It's kind of small, but there were concerns over the structural capabilities of the existing mast arm, but I did want to mention that we are designing some concepts for much larger signage now that would go on their own structure and that could be implemented on this and other bus lanes in the future. And then moving down the corridor. When it came to like the intersection treatments, rather than do the red skip stripe that we did on Rosendale, we switched to using a dash line instead. We're using for the shared bus and right turns, which is a lot of the intersections except where there's one way coming into Brighton Avenue. And then looking at that customized yield to bus and bike signage. And then reinforcing it with the bus and bike only signs throughout. And then we did move a couple of bus stops in the near term as part of the rollout, but we did verify that they were all ADA compliant before that move happened. And the city actually had boots on the grounds here as well, because they went and talked to every abutter to ensure that there was not going to be any pushback once we got into construction. And then at the end of the lane, just looking at adding the bus lane ends sign. This ends just shortly after the last bus stop in this segment. So it just allows enough space for the bus to be able to pull out into the travel lane again before it merges with general traffic. And then because we had a traditional bike lane that we needed to feed into, we're able to kind of transition that shared zone for bikes in the travel lane and put in a bike box at the signal as well. And it really was a success from the bike side of things. You can see a variety of pictures here that show, people, they're not even wearing helmets. They're riding the recumbent and electric bikes. People are traveling in all different parts of the bus and bike lane. And even parents, guardians, are willing to bike in the shared lane with their kids on the bike. But it's not without its challenges. Sometimes there's going to be occasion where buses may get behind a cyclist or the other way around, as Matt mentioned. And then despite the city's best efforts to help curb some of the concerns with parking, they did reprogram and expand some loading zones. They added some 5-minute parking areas for like pickup, drop off, TNCs, curbside deliveries, that kind of thing. But there was still a little double parking going on in the bus lane, at least last year. So hopefully some of that has curbed since then. But really it was a success. The bus is bypassing the traffic queues like it's supposed to, but it is accessible to Boston Public School buses and emergency services as well. And then just quickly on the outbound side, again, a transition from the bike lane into the shared bus bike facility here. And then at the end, the buses are turning right here. So we just needed to terminate the bus lane here and then open up that skip stripe zone for buses could merge with right turn vehicles. But the hope is actually that that lane will continue outbound up Cambridge Street. We have a design plan in the works here for when things are ready to move on that. And that's not quite it either. There's bigger plans to improve stops along the Brighton Ave corridor. We've designed curb extensions for all the stops. We're trying to think ahead and accommodate, you know, 2 40-foot buses or a 60-foot articulated bus in the event that those types of vehicles are operational in the corridor in the future, which is going to enable us to add more amenities and really improve the public realm. And there's also some pedestrian improvements. So this one over here at Alston Street, we're actually adding an additional crosswalk leg. So we're making some signal modifications and curb ramp improvements, obviously, as part of that. So is that it? That's, you know, a lot of the detail we wanted to get into today, but I did want to mention we're already working on another bus lane and have been. A lot of these have been running actually in parallel with each other, keeping us very busy. Warren Street is really complex. It's 1.5 miles long. For the most part, it's 2 lanes each direction with parking and bike lanes, but there are narrow segments. So the right of way does vary throughout the corridor, but the goal here is to take the parking lane on the west side, implement it to a cycleway, which would enable dedicated bus only lanes in both directions through most of the corridor. Which would look something like this alongside curb extensions, floating bus stops. And in response to the pandemic, the goal is hopefully to implement some of this signing and striping this fall, and then come back next year and actually do all the bus stop curb extension shelter work. And there is still more. Sorry, it's a little sticky. There's many more miles that have been constructed or still in design. Some of them even having center running BRT been expedited on the design side. Columbus Avenue is close to final design. They hope to start construction on that this fall. And the city has a Healthy Streets initiative in response to COVID-19. So there's a few bus lanes throughout the city that hopefully will get implemented in the fall as well. And I did want to make a shout out because it's not just Boston. It's cities and towns surrounding the city of Boston who've also implemented bus lanes. You know, from Everett, who kicked it all off with their pilot project back in 2017. Cambridge is doing it, Somerville, Arlington, even the state agencies, DCR, MassDOT are looking at it. And I just wanted to mention briefly that we are working on establishing bus lane standards with MBTA in coordination with MassDOT, which they would ultimately adopt and would be available to municipalities to utilize going forward. And a few of these bus lanes or components of BRT were funded through a Bar Foundation grant, and all of those bus lanes, although pilots, have since been made permanent. So Greg, I think it's about time we start to talk about Rhode Island now, huh?
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you, Matt. It was really informative. Hang on, let me pull back control. All righty. Thank you. I'm going to keep my presentation fairly brief because I do think there's a lot of really good conversation that I want to have with you all about some of the I've been jotting down some questions as you guys have been going through. So this has been really great, but I am going to talk a little bit about, okay, why is it not working? I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of where Rhode Island is in the bus lane conversation. And just to give everyone a little bit of context of sort of how Rhode Island compares to Massachusetts at this point. I'm not limited to strictly just bus lanes. I am talking about sort of bus priority measures in general, which extend to things like transit signal prioritization, queue jump lanes, that kind of thing. But I'm going to keep it pretty high level and move pretty quickly here. So just to give everyone a little history of sort of how bus lanes have gone so far in Rhode Island. Starting in 2011, Ripton, the City of Providence began work on a rapid bus corridor to combine two routes, Route 11, which is the Broad Street route in Providence, and Route 99, which is the North Main Street route in Providence, connecting up to Pawtucket. And by combining those two routes and consolidating bus stops and investing in transit priority measures, the intention of that project was to improve the overall travel reliability and service frequency of that route. That route launched in 2014 as the R line. We invested in transit signal prioritization at 60 plus intersections. If you're unfamiliar with what that is, TSP is a technology that allows buses to communicate directly with traffic signals to either provide extended green lights for when buses are on the tail end of a green light so they don't get stuck at a red, or maybe in some conditions will truncate a red on the cross street to provide buses with the opportunity to get through the intersection a little more quickly. Additionally, we also installed several queue jump lanes along the corridor to give buses an extra jump around traffic at specific intersections where there's congestion. Specifically, you might be familiar, North Main and Doyle Street is one location. That launched in 2014. It was actually a pretty big success for us. Travel times actually did become more stable, and we were actually able to save enough money that we were actually, by making those investments, that we're actually able to remove a bus from service while providing the same amount of service, which allowed us to reinvest that vehicle into other times. And essentially what that means is we were able to get more service on the street for the same amount of money that we're spending as operating this as two separate routes. So we extended hours in the evening, we improved frequency in the evening, and we drastically improved frequency on Saturdays and Sundays. And our passengers really liked that. In 2016, we began work on the Downtown Transit Connector, which is a slightly different project than the R line in the sense that I'll get more into detail about that shortly. But it included bus-only lanes along segments throughout downtown Providence, including Dyer Street, Eddy Street, and Exchange Street. 2019, we began the development of Transit Forward Rhode Island, and that was a partnership between RIPTA, RIDOT, and the statewide planning program. And this is a 20-year plan to identify key transit investments across the state, including bus lanes. I will talk more about that as well. In 2020, we finally have started installing those bus lanes we were planning back in 2016. 2021, we actually will be working with the city of Pawtucket and with RIDOT on the installation of bus lanes along Exchange Street in Pawtucket as part of the project to build a new bus hub and commuter rail station in Pawtucket. And then in 2021, we also have more transit signal prioritization being deployed across the state on five routes. Again, just to help make bus travel times more stable in locations where we may not have the width or to provide bus lanes. So I talked about the Downtown Transit Connector a little bit, and because this is the project where we are currently deploying bus lanes, I figured this is the one. This is probably the most relevant thing for this conversation for Rhode Island. The Downtown Transit Connector, or the DTC as we call it, is a federally funded project that will create a high capacity corridor through downtown Providence from Providence Station to Rhode Island Hospital. It's 7 overlapping bus routes that basically form a high frequency service. And when you combine those 7 routes, you're provided with a 5-minute frequency that goes from Providence Station all the way down to Rhode Island Hospital. We're in the midst of construction of 6 highly identifiable stops. There was a stop at Providence Station, stop at Kennedy Plaza, stop at Dorrance Street in the heart of Down City, a stop at Ship Street in front of the new pedestrian park and by the new Wexford building, a stop at South Street Landing, that's a tongue twister, South Street Landing that serves the new Brown Medical School, our nursing school, and also the Brown Medical School, and then again a stop at Rhode Island Hospital. This project also is installing about a mile of bus lanes, significant bike lanes as well, and then we're also installing new transit-only signals and some transit signal prioritization as well. Additionally, we're purchasing several vehicles with this to help us increase the amount of service that we're providing on this corridor. This service started back in January of this year, and in the first month of service, we saw a 10% increase in ridership across the 7 routes. Route 72 in particular had a 48% increase in ridership. So we were very happy with that. And then of course, the world kind of got turned upside down in mid-March, and ridership has bottomed out, but we are slowly coming back from that. but you know, all signs point to this was going to be a success. Construction is, if you're familiar with downtown Providence, is ongoing and is actually in the midst of completing in the next few weeks. Just last night, they were painting more bus lanes, so it's really exciting for us. Just wanted to show a couple pictures of what we're installing. So these are shelters that were being installed back in mid-March. They're very large. We've rebuilt sidewalks, added ADA accessibility devices. They'll have large digital displays in them. They're big. This is an example of the striping as it was being installed. You'll notice the lane markings are not in yet, so we actually have the red lanes down, but the actual white stripes that delineate them from other traffic were not installed at this point. I'd be happy to report those were all installed last night in the middle of a hurricane, which was exciting. But this is Exchange Street heading into Kennedy Plaza from the train station at the corner of Memorial. Another shelter, again, mid-installation at Johnson and Wales in front of the Yenna Center. This is the Dorrance Street stop. And then this is an example of the transit signals that we're going to be that have been installed. And you may notice you've got your normal traffic signals, but if you look on the traffic mast or across the street, there's a separate traffic mast that have different signals that have a horizontal bar. Those are the bus only signals that will allow our buses to have their own signal through those intersections. So buses will be given priority over other vehicles using the corridor. This is a picture again of Exchange Street heading up towards the train station. This is the opposite direction of Exchange, looking up to the State House. You'll see that the bus, this is actually from this morning when the bus lanes were installed. So very excited to see that. And when it's all done, this is what it's going to look like. You'll see the shelters are a little more polished because they're completed in this picture, but this is what this will look like. So I want to go back to this slide for a moment because it is relevant. And you know, I wanted to really actually point out two bullets that I mentioned. And that's specifically that we began work on the downtown transit connector 4 years ago, and the bus lanes were only installed this spring. And so that sort of begs the question as to why did this take so long for us? And why did it take 4 years for us to plan and implement bus lanes? And then I think the other question that you would ask is, well, what have we learned from that process? And then I think a third question that's relevant that I'm going to open it up to have a more broader conversation with Matt and with Sandra is, what can we learn from our peers that are quickly implementing these bus lanes to deliver them more efficiently in Rhode Island? So I can answer the why it took so long question, and it really boils down to sort of 4 bullet points. I won't belabor any of these too much, but I do think that we've learned a lot from the Downtown Transit Connector project and how to better refine that process to not make the same mistakes again. I'll briefly go over these. First bullet is plan engineering. In short, this is a term we coined. I don't know if we coined it or not. I'd like to take credit for it. But plan engineering is basically that this was a project that we were essentially trying to both plan this project, design this project, and construct this project all at the same time. The funding we received from FTA was a construction grant, and yet the project had not been designed to a level that we were confident we could construct. So we had a lot of strange timelines we were trying to meet while also trying to build the best project possible. As part of that, stakeholder engagement just took a very long time. I think this is a project that because it was awarded as a construction project, we had to really do a lot of work to make sure our stakeholders were fully engaged through this process and that everyone was comfortable with what we were proposing in terms of bus lanes and just making sure that we were addressing concerns and working with all different kinds of stakeholders on this project. And again, because this was the first set of bus lanes, permitting and approvals took a very long time. I think a lot of people were scratching their heads when we said we want to put bus lanes on Eddy Street in Providence, and they weren't really quite sure how that was going to work. And so it just took a lot of hand holding as we were working with the different stakeholders that needed to permit and approve this project. And then probably the fourth point as to why this took so long and why it took 4 years is really, quite frankly, that it was an ambitious project that had a lot of moving parts to it. It wasn't just painting bus lanes, but also rebuilding traffic signals and rebuilding sidewalks and rebuilding new bus stops. And there was just a lot to it. And quite frankly, the bus lanes they've gone down relatively quickly, but it was a lot of moving parts to get to that point. So we've learned sort of 3 things from that process. I think the first one, and this is probably the most universal, is just we need to find champions that can support us when we hit roadblocks. And what I mean by this is that RIPTA is a transit agency that doesn't necessarily have jurisdiction over a lot of the areas where we wanted to make improvements. And so it took a lot of coordination and it took a lot of partnership. And it was tough only because, we'd have conversations with our partners at the city who are working with on the project. And, there were times where you'd have to really rely on and have a lot of faith in that partnership to get us through those crises, those difficulties. Additionally, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Again, pretty universal. There were a lot of times on this project where, we had an obligation to deliver on a timeline, but if we were to, we didn't want to let the project basically become over-designed. And then I think most importantly, just know where we're going. And again, this was a project where, we started this project with a concept that was, had a lot of room for interpretation and growth. And there wasn't a lot of shared consensus about how the project actually was going to take shape initially. And that added a lot of difficulty. And so if we had a unified vision as a state as to what we were trying to accomplish, it would have saved a lot of time and a lot of unnecessary agita. So on the heels of that, we've actually been involved in a plan to figure out where we are going. And this, I think, is going to be so in 2019, I mentioned we started work on Transit Forward Rhode Island, which is a long-range visionary plan to prioritize transit investments across the state. This is a partnership that's occurring between RIPTA, RIDOT, and the Division of Statewide Planning. And at the end of this process, it is going to set out a series of recommendations so that we'll have a guiding document that will focus our transit investments on projects to both improve the system for our current riders while also making the system attractive to new riders. And this has been I think it's been a needed thing, because if we've learned anything from the DTC, if we can all have some shared consensus of where investment needs to be made, it's going to be a lot easier to make those investments in the future. We actually specifically address bus lanes in that project. The image on the left is taken from one of the policy papers we developed that looks at specific types of interventions we can take as a state to improve transit. And this is taken from the one that's focused on providing transit priority. And this shows a potential network of rapid bus type improvements, which include things like bus lanes. The image on the right is sort of helping explain how different levels of transit intensity from regional rapid bus, which may have bus lanes, all the way up to light rail, which has its own dedicated right of way. So that's it for my presentation, but I did really want to open this up to have a conversation with Matt and Sandra about some of the specific things that I think we can learn. I have a whole series of questions that I have for you guys. I certainly don't want to hog the microphone though. So if any of the attendees have any questions or thoughts as well, I certainly would encourage them. But just to start things off, I'm going to start with a question I've got from Matt. And one thing I think that's been enlightening for me in just working with you and Sandra on this presentation is the relationship that you have with the MBTA, because I think that's really interesting that you don't work for the MBTA, you work for the city of Boston, correct? I believe you're on mute.
Exactly.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the relationship between the city of Boston and MBTA and how you got to a point where the city is actually leading the efforts to install bus lanes?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a few things that have happened in the past few years that really make this possible. So the first thing is on the city side. Go Boston 2030 recommended a series of new positions be created. One of those positions was a transit team and director of that team. So my position was created to really facilitate that coordination between the MBTA and city staff, enable sort of a smooth, process for implementing projects, not just for buses, but also for our rail side and our ferry side. So, and then sort of in a parallel track, very, very similar timelines to the MBTA created a new bus priority, transit priority team. And that was tasked with engaging municipalities on bus priority throughout the region. But sort of Boston being such a big player, we end up spending a lot of time coordinating with this group. And so it's really been through that partnership between the T's transit priority team, the city's transit team, that we've been able to get a lot of the projects sort of fast-tracked and implemented. As I mentioned before too, it also helps to have funding on the MBTA side. So the MBTA has graciously sort of funded the design and implementation of a number of these projects. And then it also helps to have a guiding document. So Go Boston 2030 really lays the groundwork for trying to shift modes and shift people from single occupancy vehicles into more sustainable modes. So a number of things have come together, but I think it's been pretty successful.
Yeah, would you? I mean, I'm just curious. Like, would you say that it's been the city pushing the T, or the T pushing the city, or has it been a little? I'm sorry to put you on the spot like that, but I'm fascinated by the fact that it's the city of Boston that's actually leading the effort here, and so it's
a little bit of both. Like in any good partnership, there's push and pull in both directions. So, again, I'll go back to Go Boston. There were a number of projects laid out in Go Boston that were city priorities. It wasn't just transit, right? There's a number of bike priority projects. There's a number of projects to enhance sort of pedestrian infrastructure. But that sort of laid the groundwork for projects that we wanted to pursue. And then the T also, through CTPS and through MassDOT, was able to develop a priority list of bus corridors where they said, there's just so much congestion here. There's so much ridership here. The equity considerations are so intense. We need to sort of collaborate together. So I'd say the list is kind of 90% similar, where we have our priority projects, the T has their priority projects, they 90% overlap. And as I said, it sort of gets down to most of the details and the nuances of design, of community process, where we sort of have to work out some of those details.
Great. I'm seeing
Greg, just to add to that, I think the contract mechanisms that I mentioned briefly are really important too. Like, a lot of projects will go out to bid for multi-phases of the project, which just really elongates the whole process. But having, a somewhat generic scope that you can kind of tap into and just keep that momentum going, I think was really key. That, I guess, the T was accepting of that general scope, and also on the consultant side, we were willing to kind of work with them on it as well. So.
Great. No, that's really helpful. I'm seeing a couple of questions from Betty. And actually, I had some notes about this as well, so I'm going to add a couple of my own questions in there with yours, Betty. But she's asking, what are the problems with cyclists sharing a lane with buses? And then she's asking if there are other cities that we're aware that have successfully implemented shared bus lanes, and do they have designs that differ significantly from those Boston designs? And then, I'm sorry, I'm going to lump it all in because it is, my sort of follow-up was, how, I think that's actually one of the comments I made was sort of, I think especially here in New England, spaces at a premium, because we're usually dealing with older roadways that don't have, I don't want to live in Phoenix, but I envy their ability to have a lot of space to reallocate sometimes. And so I'm curious, how does the city weigh those sort of costs between bike infrastructure and bus infrastructure, and when do they say it's appropriate to install a bus lane or a bike lane, or because sometimes, often those are unfortunately in competition with each other.
Do you want me to start with this one, Sandra?
Yes, I can tag on. But...
Sorry.
No, so a lot of times so first thing I'll mention sort of on the advocacy side, a lot of times the transit advocacy and the bike advocacy groups sort of overlap a lot. So, there's not always consensus, but I think there's generally consensus about where it's very important to have a bike corridor, where it's important to have a bus corridor, and where they might need to share. The second thing too is we look to guidance from NACTO. So NACTO, National Association of City Transportation Officials, I believe is the acronym. They sort of lay out guidance for when bikes and buses can share. And there's a certain threshold for bus service. So when buses are, I believe it's above every 4 minutes or 5 minutes.
Every 4. Mm-hmm.
4 minutes, thank you. they can, if it's sort of more, it's more than every 4 minutes, they can typically share, because your typical cyclist will pass a bus over the course of a trip, especially for corridors where buses are going 20 miles an hour or less typically. You sort of have a cadence where bikes and buses have similar enough speeds, and as I said, with buses making stops, bikes can typically pass. I'm trying to think. So I mean, again, it's really a corridor by corridor approach, and oftentimes we look to enhance bike infrastructure and bus infrastructure at the same time. On another corridor that's under referenced on Warren Street, we're actually looking at having separate bus and bike lanes, because bus frequency is such and the topography is such that mixing them together probably wouldn't be the best approach. So it's really corridor specific, it's really community specific. But I mean, I think it's relying on good design, and then also relying on those NACTO guidelines, and those are available if you Google it. So
yeah, that's great. Those NACTO guidelines have been really helpful for us as well. Do you guys know of any other cities that have been experimenting with shared bus bike lanes or implementing them? And I used to live in the south end of Boston, so I'm very familiar with the Washington Street bus lanes and the bike. And I would take it was back when it was the Hubway. I would take the Hubway bikes up those and play leapfrog with the buses at times. And I know there's, I think, well, I'm just curious, do you guys know of any other examples of shared bus bike lanes nationally at all?
Not off the top of my head, but they exist. There's no doubt. Yeah. So, but it is context sensitive, factoring in topography. Not pretty much said everything I would have said.
It's not natural. The city of Everett also has a bus bike lane. And then informally, a lot of times bus lanes can be used by cyclists, right? Because you will have a much broader lane than your typical bike lane. It's typically more clear of traffic than a typical general purpose lane. So a lot of times, even in an informal way, a lot of cyclists will end up using bus lanes.
Yeah,
I think we expect on Warren Street, even though we're going to have the dedicated two-way cycleway along the western side of the street and dedicated bus lanes in each direction, if there's very confident, fast-moving bicyclists, they're probably going to stay on the northern side when they're heading northbound and just run concurrently with the buses. But we're not encouraging it through shared lane markings or things like that. But like Matt said, they're not prohibited from using the lane either.
Well, so this is something we've struggled with on the downtown transit connector, and you're hitting the nail on the head when it comes to frequencies. It's just the frequency of that corridor is so high that we've had to work with the city on, we've got bike lanes on the northern end of the project. On the southern end, it's just bus lanes because of road width. But we've worked with the city. They've got a whole program of work they've identified alternate routes through downtown. So it's not a perfect solution, but it's definitely we're trying to sort of balance how we make bus investment and do so in a way that doesn't necessarily take away from mobility options, and it's a balancing act.
It is. And the city, through their surveys, through the advocacies that helped with the surveys, they heard from a lot of bicyclists, and they really liked having that space available to them. They much rather have that rather than like a 4 or 5 foot bike lane that's in the door zone of a parking lane. Yeah,
I don't want to hog up the discussion time, and I'm just, I'm not seeing much in the way of other questions, but I just want to make sure if anyone has questions, please feel free to either type them in or raise your hand, and we'll respond to them. I do have a couple more questions, and Matt, I don't know if you or Sandra, if you have anything for us either, but I guess one question I have is, bus lanes are a little scary to the average user who's not on a bus, and I'm curious, has the city of Boston gone through any sort of educational program with people who are walking or driving and trying to retrain them sort of on how bus lanes interact with general traffic, or is that something that you all are just sort of relying on in terms of signage? I don't know, has there been any sort of public effort there?
Yeah, it's a good question. So at the beginning of all the lanes, what we do is a sort of flyering campaign, as I mentioned earlier. So as we're planning, people I think have a good sense of what's being planned, and a lot of the users of a corridor, use it on a daily basis or weekly basis. So people I think get familiar through the planning process and that initial flyering process. And then before the bus lane actually goes operational, we do another flyering effort. Again, car windshields, merchants, residents, just to, again, let people know that this is coming, but also on that flyer, there's a really good graphic that we use that was developed by the city of Cambridge. And it shows very generally how bus lanes work, when cars are allowed to make a right turn and enter the lane. And then throughout the corridor, as Sandra alluded to in her presentation, there's signage. So people understand where they're allowed to enter the bus lane to make a right turn, or sort of what the prohibitions are for using it. And then last, we sort of we work with the MBTA Transit Police on the first week of implementation to have a very soft enforcement operation. So if a car is in the bus lane, it'll typically get pulled over by the transit police, but they won't issue a citation. They'll just give a verbal warning. And again, having that presence there and having people see, that red pavement, the pavement markings, I think gives enough of an indication for most motorists that this is not the space for them, but they should stay in the left lane or whatever the lane might be.
Yeah.
Yeah, Matt mentioned Cambridge. They had a big public campaign surrounding it, some great materials to really educate users and drivers and bicyclists, but also Arlington through their BRT pilot, through the Bar Foundation funded grant too. They also, similar to Matt said, they had police and not enforcement, but more warning and guidelines. Say, you can't be in here, and really educate them rather than enforce and ticket. So it took a little bit. I think they may have ticketed eventually, but at least for the initial days of operation, it was more of an educational campaign.
Matt and Sandra, I have a question. Clearly your implementation of this so far has been successful because you're continuing to do more of them and they're being embraced by the community. And as Greg pointed out, anytime we're taking real estate and dividing it up, there's going to be competing interests for that. But I'm curious to know if there's been any data. You've got great data on the increase in transit ridership as a result of implementing. But is there any data that on auto traffic as a result of implementing bus priority lanes? Has there been a demonstrated slowdown in traffic? Has it actually helped to improve congestion? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think Matt can probably contribute more than I can, but they did do a post-implementation study on Brighton Avenue, which showed that traffic volumes did drop by 10%, and that's probably partly a trip redistribution. People are finding alternative ways rather than traveling the corridor, but also probably a mode shift because we're seeing that increase in ridership.
Yeah. So Sandra's point, we saw a growth in ridership, and at the same time we also saw decreasing traffic volumes on Brighton Avenue. So not necessarily the two are directly correlated, but I think that there's a good indication that people are either finding a different route to take if they're still driving, or because we now have more reliable service, they've decided I don't need to take that TNC, I can now get on a bus, use the bus as a quicker trip. The second thing too that we did is, and so again, Sandra alluded to this in her presentation, was we looked at where double parking was an issue on the corridor, and we worked with the merchants to reallocate some of the 2-hour parking to 30-minute commercial loading until 7 o'clock at night, and then from 7 o'clock on to 5-minute TNC pickup drop-off. And what that did is it sort of freed up curb space for sort of more temporary use. And so just, again, this is more of an anecdotal element, but our director of parking enforcement said he used to receive daily calls about issues on Brighton Avenue because double parking is so endemic. But by sort of redistributing some of that parking, he now rarely gets a call about Brighton Avenue. Of course, it still happens. You can't control, you can't be everywhere at all times, but it does show that there is some ability to improve traffic or improve the parking situation when you're doing these bus lane corridors. And it's, again, close engagement with merchants to identify where those spots are.
And I
So
would
we've got
just add that on the traffic side of things that, you know, for the most part, we were using existing data available. One, because the project was so fast tracked, we didn't really have the time to mobilize. Plus, once COVID-19 hit, you know, we haven't been doing any traffic counts. So we might have used it, that it's a few years old. Studies have shown that the volumes have generally dropped since then. So our analysis has been very conservative. It's probably unlikely that the volumes are actually that high. So because they're, you know, the results of those more conservative analysis, and the city and other communities are willing to kind of entertain that change in level of service, increased delay, based on the higher volumes, kind of speaks a lot to that.
So one final question is, and I know that Matt, in Boston, you've played a leadership role in implementing bus priority lanes, and that, you know, you're in a great position to be able to coordinate on the city side. And I'm wondering if there are any lessons learned from some of the other communities that have advanced bus priority lanes when maybe somebody from the municipality is not necessarily leading it, in terms of being able to coordinate the approvals that are needed from the city. Are there any lessons to be learned from comparing Boston with some of the other communities? You don't have to name them, but just in terms of the dynamics of how that worked.
So I'm a little bit less familiar with some of the other communities, but I think Greg alluded to this in his presentation. It always helps to have a local champion. So if that local champion is a person from a public works department, a transportation department, a local elected official, I think it always helps to have a person that can help guide it through that local approval process, who's familiar with sort of city policy, city bureaucracy, and sort of just the right people to talk to in order to get a project sort of moving, you know. What are the approvals needed? What's the analysis needed? To Sandra's point, should we be more conservative on the traffic analysis? Should we be more ambitious on it? And then also just sort of on the community group side, who to talk to from the community to make sure that you're covering all your bases. You know, the sort of outreach we did in Rosendale for Washington Street was very different than the outreach we did on Bright Nav. And a lot of that had to do with the sort of dynamics in the communities. Rosendale is much more residential. Bright Nav is much more commercial. So having sort of that person with like a local knowledge to help fine tune that approach, I think is probably the most key part.
Fantastic, great lessons. This has been very informative. I want to thank you, Greg and Matt and Sandra. And for folks who are in the audience, next up is going to be a webinar next week, same time, on the Transportation and Climate Initiative, TCI, which may just present opportunities for how best to fund improvements such as bus priority lanes. So you're welcome to visit the website and see the full offerings, and we hope to see you at the see you next week. And thanks again to our panel for a great informative discussion.
Thank you, John.
John.
Okay.
John.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.